Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Freshagenda, Ever.Ag's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back with a pretty hefty update this week. We've got the usual market updates, some of the highlights from last week's UKLA General Assembly in Copenhagen, the GDT results, some trade highlights out of EU, and of course China Week.
Let's get rolling.
Yeah, and first of all, we'll stay in Europe. And spot milk and cream prices continue to firm, Steve, last week. The rain across a lot of areas of the continent, in the northern areas, really hasn't altered the situation for milk and cream prices, it seems. Other futures have weakened a bit. So this kind of contrasts to the spot markets at the moment, but maybe a bit more concern emerging about some buyer resistance, particularly in retail markets where margins are pretty skinny and, might be harder to push increases through. So just one to watch.
Value's fairly flat for the next 5 months, though, aren't they?
Absolutely. Not moving much at all. And then for skim milk powder, weaker with pretty poor prospects for recovery in demand that we're seeing there, Steve.
Yeah.
And going across to New Zealand, skim milk powder is also weakening in the short term. That suggests that buyers have no problems with availability. They're sitting on adequate stocks, and they're probably quite confident about the availability of skim milk powder as we head towards a peak of production later this year, Steve. And China's not really coming back with more whole milk powder demand. So,
and speaking of whole milk powder, there's pretty heavy backwardation in this forward price curve. $400 a ton, more than $400 a ton out to October. No change in the sentiment towards China at all, really, on the horizon. We did see a recent update from BOABC, which kind of indicated, the recovery might be pushed further down the road. And maybe Southeast Asia is maxed out after some pretty strong trade in recent periods. To the US spot markets, where prices have been quite mixed. Butter's certainly firmer on some stronger domestic interest. All that talk about big exports hasn't really shown up in numbers yet, but it's the domestic disappearance that's been very strong. That might be a hint for later. And, looking at the cheese market there, the prices have come off as well in the short term. It's been volatile. It's bounced around a tight range, but it's just weakening in the last week. And in futures markets, we've seen this as well. From C2 onwards, there's been a weakness there. Again, as we see new plants gradually fill, even though the stories are that things are going to happen later, we're not seeing much movement when you go past November. But in the short term, no problem with availability. The butter market in the US, pretty strong carry, pretty self-enforcing really, buying spot, sell forward. So the spot market is moving up with that stronger interest to take advantage of this forward curve. Prices moving up well into the 6,000s by the time we get towards the end of the year.
Yeah, and across to non-fat dry milk still in the US. Non-fat dry milk is really slipping away, and that's pretty much in line with what's happening in the Oceania and EU market, Steve. It might sort of put an end to the hesitant kind of stuttered run that we've seen on prices. They've been trading in a pretty tight range in the last 3 weeks, Steve, just probably looking for some direction.
So we were at the UKLA General Assembly in the second half of last week, and we thought we could summarise what we took away from that to keep it tight. On the market side of things, the recent rain we've talked about a bit was heavily forecast, and there was quite a bit of it, but it hasn't really changed the short-term butterfat markets, at least in the short term. So the views were, there are good margins out there for producers, relatively low feed prices with abundant global supplies, and there should be some decent milk solids growth coming through coming months. There's different views on that. It's quite mixed. But when we look at the products or the commodities, it's quite a mixed butter outlook. ZMB's presentation from Monica indicates that there's some risk of stock building through towards the end of the year. I guess generally the tone on skim milk powder was bearish with weak confectionery demand coming through, and again the story about no challenge to availability out of Oceania. Things look fairly bearish on high pro whey, even though in the short term markets are quite tight. And we see, the diverse and strong demand from a whole range of applications. But there was quite a bit of discussion with a couple of presentations looking at the divergence between whey and milk proteins, and the feeling were that whey proteins would come back to the pack with higher US availability later in the year, that we couldn't sustain the current situation, particularly with a very flat trajectory for skim milk powder. And in the cheese market, the European cheese market's fairly stable, though I would call it fragile to nervous, with high prices. While retail demand seems to be okay, food service demand seems to be plateauing. That whole consumer spending challenge is still there. And the other complication for the EU exporters is the weak US dollar, which just seems to be getting weaker as we go further into quite a complex geopolitical situation. But on policy, Joe, what did you take away?
Yeah, look, there were some really good updates from Arla and the Danish Dairy Board, given that we were in Denmark. Pretty topical discussion about the carbon tax that the Danish government's proposing. They're going pretty hard on their emissions reduction program. It was quite philosophical. The Danish Dairy Board spokesperson was sort of saying, look, we're going to take the approach that we want to work with the government. We won't be dropping loads of manure or burning any tractor tyres outside the Houses of Parliament. We want to work with the government in terms of building the measurement and the kind of regimen that they'll be operating under. And Arla was sort of indicating they see some commercial opportunities in terms of measuring this kind of sustainability aspects of production accurately for the market. Obviously, lots of trade policy discussion. It's a trading meeting, but also given that the EU is currently negotiating with the US, and we were getting some, I guess, updates on how it was going with China as well, although that's not totally clear still. There wasn't a lot of optimism around the EU-US discussions. The readout from the negotiators was kind of to expect the worst. So not really sure what that looks like. A lot of people were sort of saying it doesn't even feel like a negotiation in the, more commonly understood sense of the word, which is probably accurate. We also had a really interesting update. Well, interesting is a strong word, but we had an update from the EU Commission. One of the DG Agri commissioners was actually very entertaining, just giving us an update about the latest visions for agriculture in the EU and using word counts to just indicate that maybe the emphasis has changed a little bit more supportive of livestock production within the EU, a little less emphasis on reducing emissions, and a lot of discussions about making agriculture attractive for people and reducing compliance costs. So that was very much welcomed by the meeting participants. And this is really a precursor, Steve, to the Common Agricultural Policy updates that we'll see in a couple of months' time, I think, or in coming months. And as we know, the devil will be in the detail. Yeah. But there was, a fairly good feeling that maybe the emphasis has just shifted a little bit in the European Union.
Yes, it was an entertaining, witty presentation from the deputy of that group in the commission, leading us into an entertaining GDT result. So this result, quite mixed, gets wilder as you go to the further right of that chart. 1% down overall in the index. Milk powders continue to drift, obviously, with from New Zealand. Whole milk powder this time lost more, almost 3% at the second contract, and skim milk powder again, New Zealand product faring a little worse than the EU in dollar terms. That changes when you convert to euros. Fats were quite mixed. There's certainly a pattern there. It was stronger earlier and both falling heavier towards the end of, later in the year when we see more product out in New Zealand. And with butter, there's certainly a heavy slide in later prices. When we look, Joe, though, at the comparison across regions, it's a bit more interesting.
Yeah, look, comparing butter and cheese outcomes, EU numbers were worse in euros. So the US has gained 2 cents in the past 2 weeks, but the Solar Egg butter product prices fell 0.5% in euro terms, and mozzarella fell 3.3% in euro terms. So, yeah, probably some mixed results there again in terms of those New Zealand versus European product.
So they kind of go against what we've seen in their local markets, haven't we?
Yeah. Just depends on who turns up, I guess.
It always does.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of demand to supply ratios, this time skim milk powder was weaker than average. The whole milk powder demand curve through the event was basically identical to the previous event, number 381. So thankfully, we won't have to look at those graphs of those curves. Fats was strong on pretty small volumes available, not enough to lift the AMF pricing though, Steve.
No. So looking at involvement, whole milk powder, China's involvement was down a little in whole milk powder, which is probably the disappointing thing. But Joe, the Middle East?
Yeah, look, this is always one to keep an eye on. We find with Middle Eastern buyers, they're pretty good at coming in when prices are weakening and securing products. So as prices have dipped, we're starting to see the involvement from that region just tick up again. So we'll continue to watch that, Steve. And in terms of skim milk powder, small improvement for China compared to the previous auction. And predictably, Southeast Asia has stepped back a little bit, like a fair bit compared to the prior auction, Steve.
One comes on, the other one steps back. It used to be a bit of a roller coaster, particularly this one. There's such less of a dramatic roller coaster in this chart than there was late last year.
And in terms of skim milk powder, hasn't this gap narrowed between European and New Zealand products, Steve? And in forward prices, it's actually flipped. So, Steve, what about butter?
I talked about this steep decline. I mean, that curve, it did flatten out after the last event. We saw, we've seen this move around quite a bit. It has been backwardated for in the past, particularly in the futures. But here there's a real dip, more than, we're seeing $1,200 variance between C1 and C5 there. So the expectation is going to be plenty around, weakening the market, and it kind of is influencing Europe, I think, to some extent as well, with that, world price falling. You're not going to be able to get away without some influence there. Yeah. Your favourite, Joe?
Yeah, look, I love this one. The strong C2 butter gain of $475 a tonne has widened this gap by more than $600 a tonne in fat terms. So that's pretty remarkable. We thought it was turning the other way, Steve, but it's just taken a bit of a U-turn again with this event.
Yeah.
And in terms of this, my other favourite, the whole milk powder versus synthetic value, that's really narrowed. It's the lowest gap between whole milk powder values and the, analogue skim and AMF values for 6 months, Steve. So some interesting trends there.
I told you this was entertaining. So where does it leave us?
Yeah, look, again, as we said earlier, for skim milk powder, this has flipped. So we're seeing, NZX futures weaker than the other regions. EX futures at the top of that very compressed range there, and GDT just poking out there above CME futures. So, interesting change there, Steve.
And when we look at butter, the forwards have weakened here generally. The EU certainly a little softer, while the US market has firmed. So this is sort of converging. Certainly later this year, you see those NZX and CME futures coming closer together. But I've pulled out another view, which is, I think, more interesting, which puts AMF onto this chart and shows AMF pricing in a better context, which is very close to the US market. So this is the GDT results for AMF overlaid on the CME futures, and they're very close. It sort of indicates that AMF is being priced at the marginal, the price of the marginal player or the possibly swing player in terms of, US having more availability. So I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, kind of makes it make sense.
Yeah. Some trade results. Joe, you want to take us through this one?
Yeah, look, EU export data for April, overall 1.3% up in milk solids equivalent terms. It's the second small gain in a row. WPC 80 was plus 17%, and really China driving that increase. Fats up 9% despite the very high prices out of Europe, and that's butter to the US. So that Kerrygold butter just can't get enough. Skim milk powder up 2% for the month, and cheese was also up 2%, and that was really driven by Japan and the UK, Steve.
So just looking at skim milk powder, Joe, this was quite an interesting result when we pulled this apart, that Skim only up 2% in the month, but it's the highest monthly tonnage since nearly 2 years, July 23 or June 23. Sorry, that with a 67% jump in Southeast Asian volumes. So that overcame some pretty steep falls in the MENA region, where buyers certainly backed off, and a lack of tender activity into North Africa helping that. But interesting, that would have tightened things up a bit, and it's surprising when you see what we've looked at earlier with those forward prices weakening so much. Bring us home, Joe, with the chart of the week.
Yeah, and so the chart of the week, we're in the States actually. Looking at the commercial disappearance data that came out for April, overall cheese was 1% higher year over year in April. It's a second month of year-on-year increase after 5 months of declines. We're showing the 6-month rolling average in the chart here, Steve. It's still pretty negative. You've got 1 month of data doesn't really tell you very much. We've got to monitor this over some time, and we're hoping that the USDA is still able to collect accurate data. American cheese was up 2.5% for April and 0.2% for the 6 months, the rolling 6 months to April. And other cheese, that's including mozzarella, was down 1.2%. So obviously watching this pretty carefully, Steve, with that ramp up in capacity. What the domestic market consumes will determine what the export availability will be out of the US. So pretty important one to keep an eye on.
Okay, that's a wrap. We'll be back next week. Thanks for watching. I hope you can join us.